Hello, my name is Adhiraj Mantan, and today I'm going to be talking about Cushing syndrome. So, a little background information about who I am. My name is Adhiraj Mantan, or you can call me Adi, and I am a current junior at the School of Coppell High School in Dallas, Texas. And throughout my high school career, I feel like I found an interest in medicine and especially pursuing something in endocrinology. So, what is Cushing syndrome? Cushing syndrome is defined as the overproduction of cortisol. And cortisol is basically a stress hormone in the body that causes rapid weight gain and other complications such as hypertension, high blood pressure, diabetes, obesity, osteoporosis, purple striae, which is stretch marks, hirsutism, which is unexpected hair growth, and mood disorders. So how did I actually present my research? So I actually wanted to create like my own blog post on basically outlining the fundamentals of the pathophysiology of Cushing syndrome through kind of a series of 5 blog posts that kind of have their own part to what makes up Cushing syndrome. So so I kind of also wanted to outline what a Cushing syndrome patient kind of look like. This is kind of an oversimplified diagram, but you can kind of see that this patient obviously has a bit of excess weight along with that purple striae or stretch marks, which are clear indicators of Cushing syndrome. Along with other symptoms, such as when I talked about hirsutism, which is unexpected hair growth. This is usually seen in a lot of patients who are women, along with osteoporosis, which I'll get more in depth with, and then high blood pressure as patients with Cushing syndrome are 80% more prevalent to higher blood pressure. So this is kind of just outlining what my blog posts were. So now I'm going to get into more detail about each one. So for the first one, I just talked about an overview of the endocrine system. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I did highlight the adrenal gland over there. The adrenal gland is the most important gland when we consider Cushing syndrome, because the adrenal gland is actually where cortisol is produced. So in my second blog post, I actually went into more depth into what exactly Cushing syndrome is. So a more detailed explanation of what cortisol is, it's a stress hormone. So essentially when you're stressed, you're releasing cortisol, and cortisol actually can help maintain blood pressure and metabolize proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. But the most important fact in Cushing syndrome is to talk about the HPA axis. So if I kind of go to my blog post here, this is a better photo of the HPA axis. The HPA axis is basically the linkage between the hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal gland, and it's basically the signaling interactions between these 3 parts. So what happens in a normal patient is that the brain releases CRH, which then tells the pituitary gland to release adrenocorticotropic hormone. And then that ultimately tells the adrenal gland to produce cortisol. And what differentiates a person with Cushing syndrome and a person who's normal is that there is a negative feedback loop for a normal person, meaning when cortisol levels are too high, the body can actually maintain this by the brain signaling the whole body to shut down the release of cortisol, which ultimately balances it, making it into equilibrium. But in a Cushing syndrome patient, this whole axis is disrupted as there's no negative feedback to control the amount of cortisol, which thus prompts the body to produce an excess amount of cortisol. In my third one, I talked about the causes of Cushing syndrome, which is very important. The main idea to think about here is adenomas. Adenomas are basically non-cancerous tumors found in the body, and the most prevalent one is the one found in the pituitary gland, as seen in the photo. So essentially what happens is that the adenomas are basically prompting cortisol to be released even more. And there's also ectopic tumors. Ectopic tumors are basically tumors that are not found in the pituitary gland. They're mostly found in more random areas of the body, such as the abdomen or other areas. And they're less prevalent compared to the normal adenomas in the pituitary gland, with the prevalence of about 65%. The one I wanted to really outline in my blog post was steroids or immunosuppressors. So these steroids, also known as glucocorticoids, are the steroids that can actually induce Cushing syndrome. So if I take, for example, if you were to be a patient and you were getting an organ transplant, what happens is when that organ is transplanted into your body, the immune system in your body acts as that organ is a foreign pathogen and starts to attack it, Thus, you have to give immunosuppressions, which are basically a form of steroid. And what that steroid does is it basically reduces that immune response. But if you're using that for a long-term or prolonged process, that can actually lead to Cushing syndrome. So I just want to briefly go over how the other body systems play into this. So in the cardiovascular system, as we know, Cushing syndrome increases your body fat percentage along with blood pressure, meaning that when you have all these considered, your overall heart health is being reduced because you have higher levels of chance of getting stroke and myocardial infarction, which is heart attacks. And then the immune system is, of course, very important when considering Cushing syndrome, because cytokines and neutrophils are two main components of the immune system. Cytokines are basically growth factors that influence the development of other cells, meaning that their influence is what, or their growth is what causes other cells to be what they are. So if a cytokine becomes pro-inflammatory, what happens is that the other cells will also become pro-inflammatory, which is what happens during Cushing syndrome. And during Cushing syndrome, white blood cells are also increased, which is also known as neutrophils. And then also, as I mentioned before in the second slide, I talked about the bone density with osteoporosis. What happens is that a study showed that 70% of people with Cushing syndrome saw a reduced or lower Z-score, which is the mean, or the lower score than the mean of the average bone density, meaning that their bone density is way lower than the average person, which is a clear linkage to osteoporosis. And the final one is the test and treatments. So some lab tests could be done, such as blood, saliva, and urine. And it's very important to do this over a 24-hour period because cortisol levels fluctuate often during the night. You can also do an LDDST test. An LDDST test, basically what it does is it induces a glucocorticoid, which is a steroid, into the body. And it looks at how the HPA axis is influenced. If the HPA axis is not impaired, that is a sign of Cushing syndrome because you are still producing cortisol even when you're suppressing it. And then there's also surgeries that could be done. It depends on the size of the tumor, like the adenoma. If you have a microadenoma, which is a very small tumor, it would be harder to do a straight up surgery, but there are medical therapy that you could be offered drugs that could actually help suppress the rapid release of cortisol in the body. So there are definitely different ways to treat this condition. And that's all I had. Thank you so much. This is my email if you had any further questions on it.
Thank you, Adi. Great presentation, very interesting. Any questions from the audience? If not, I've got a few. One question I have is, similar to what I asked Nandita, is what was your inspiration for going specifically into this Cushing syndrome? Why this very specific illness?
Right. So I definitely had an interest in the endocrine system. But there are many prevalent diseases such as diabetes, but I feel like a lot of that is fairly covered and a lot of people in society know what that is, but not a lot of people know what Cushing syndrome is. Yes, it is not a very prevalent disease, only 13 in about 1 million, but there are still people who are impacted by this. And I feel like it's my duty to at least try to research and further my research into something that really hasn't been talked about much. And I think that really helped motivate me to continue.
Interesting. Yeah, so it's kind of more of an education, almost like educate the public on what this is. Another question I have is related to the treatment. Did you research are there any kind of natural or homeopathic type treatments that would help reduce the amount of cortisol or sort of prevent this feedback loop from happening? Or is it something that you'd have to do to go pretty extreme with a treatment?
It's not anything like you could fix to reduce your stress or anything. It's more of something is really being disrupted in your body because the symptoms are very severe. So it's not anything a home remedy could fix. It's more of a serious thing that needs to be medically treated immediately.
Got you. Any questions from our other panelists as well? Feel free to ask each other questions, guys. We've got plenty of time in this session. Okay. With that said, we'll let you go ahead and end it. Thank you so much for your talk, Adi. That was great. Great job. Yeah.